All right. So good afternoon, everybody. I have noon Eastern Standard Time right now. So we'll go ahead and get started. My name's Elysia Rodgers. I'm an Ag and Natural Resource Educator with Purdue Extension up in DeKalb County. So from Michigan, it's down on the Ohio line, just the second county down. So I've been with Purdue Extension for over 13 years now. And in my spare time, whatever you want to call that, my husband and I have a small farm where we raise a herd or manage a herd of, I think we have just over 100 dairy goats at the moment. We've raised boar goats in the past, and we also have a small herd of Katahdin sheep as well. So I'm excited to be here with you all today to talk about kind of hoof care, some of the issues that we see, and just the basics of taking care of those hooves of our small ruminants. So as we get started today, I am going to launch just a short little demographics poll, just so we can collect that information. It's voluntary to fill out. You don't have to fill it out. So if you want to, you can take a couple of seconds to do that while I get started on sharing my screen. All right. So like I said, been around small ruminants most of my life. Grew up in 4-H doing just the market lambs. So understood them from that perspective, and then married into goats just over 10 years ago. So that's been a learning process as well for myself. And so I told my husband when we got married that he was limited to no more than 20 goats on the property. And obviously you see how well that stayed under that line. So kind of once I started to kind of get into it and look at all the possibilities, obviously those numbers greatly increased. My husband had been married once before, and so with his prior wife, he had actually, save these real quick, had a goat dairy. So he was milking close to 150 goats at one point in time. So he's been raising goats since he was about 2, so it's pretty much all that he has known. So for me, kind of on the small ruminant kind of side of it, in terms of the hoof care, I mean, I understood kind of the basics of making sure that they had good hooves and things like that. But my frustration was coming into play when I would get animals ready for show and things like that. I didn't fully understand how to properly trim hooves and things, so I was having to wait on my husband to help with those, and I finally got fed up with it and figured out how to do it myself. So that's kind of why I'm here today, is to kind of help us all through that same process, kind of understand how to even just trim your hooves and kind of understand maybe what some of those issues may be that we may see. So at any point throughout here, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and I'll answer them as we go along or at the end when we get finished. So, all right. There you go. All right. So why is hoof care so important? Obviously, kind of one of the starting points is to kind of help prevent lameness. Yep. So this is being recorded, and I'll make sure to post the link in the chat box when we get finished, as to where you can find it once it's uploaded to one of our YouTube sites. So, yep. All right. So hoof care, obviously, when we want to prevent lameness, the hooves are obviously kind of the basis of our animals. Whether sheep or goats, if they're not walking around properly, it messes with the rest of their structure and can really lead to a lot of other issues. So we want to make sure they have a good base as they're moving around every day. We want to make sure we have airflow to kind of reach the hooves to help eliminate bacterial infections. So if you've ever obviously picked up a hoof and you see where the edge of it has curled over, that's kind of trapping all that manure, mud, what have you, in that curled over portion. And that's really a good festering ground for a lot of our bacteria, fungus, all sorts of good stuff. So that's why we want to make sure we are taking care of them as well. Again, having a flat sole surface so we don't have trapped mud, feces, possible infection, things like that hidden in there. Just, again, having a good base. And in young animals, it helps promote that proper hoof growth and can really help, especially with the hocks and the pasterns, help kind of keep those upright and where they're supposed to be a little bit, help them a little bit. Obviously, genetics play a portion in that, but also just having that proper hoof placement helps as well with those growing bones and muscles. So this, like I said, this is a task that can be easily learned. I think I YouTubed it the first couple of times I did it because I was getting frustrated waiting on my husband. So he may have helped me with a couple of trims that I had questions on, but it's really just practicing, getting in there and actually doing it. Yes, you may make your animals bleed every once in a while, but we'll talk about ways to kind of help with that in case you do have a hoof that might bleed on you. But it's a learning process. It's now to the point where this spring we had our dry yearlings out in the lot, and I was able to do, how many did I do? 34 of them in less than 3 hours out in the sun. So it's become a regular practice for me, and it's gotten much easier. So foot and leg issues arise from that lack of hoof trimming or improper trimming techniques. So we'll kind of talk about easy ways to kind of see kind of how that hoof placement is and what it really should be to help kind of train your eye to see if you did a good job kind of getting that leveled off. Really, there's no set trimming interval. It's not like every 4 weeks you have to trim. For me, it's just kind of as I notice long toes or notice maybe some pasterns starting to get a little weak or things along those lines. Or if I start to see a little bit of lameness, is kind of how we go about it. Obviously, the does that we're milking and those that I'm showing, I see quite more often. So I notice a little more quickly on if their feet are getting bad or not. Something like our dry yearlings, they definitely get done at least twice a year, unless they're being shown and unless we see issues that arise. But on our dry yearlings, twice a year is about all they get. But it's, like I said, no set trimming interval really. And really that amount of time between trimmings really varies. It depends on your terrain. So if you are in more of kind of a sandy area, that's going to be a little bit softer on the hooves. They might not grow quite as well, versus maybe you have more of a rocky base. So something like, when I'm thinking Indiana, I think like the Brown County area or somewhere down kind of that southwest region where we have several larger hills, rock outputs, things like that, that the goats can climb on to help kind of keep those hooves down a little bit more. Same with sheep. The age of the animal. Something young might grow a little bit faster than something that's a little bit more mature. Their level of activity. If you have goats that are in the barn 75% of the day, just kind of relaxing, chewing their cud, obviously they're not going to be up on their hooves quite as much. So they aren't going to be rubbing that surface down. Nutrition also plays a role in how quickly those hooves grow, and also the breed. So this is kind of a good little score that you can kind of keep track and kind of keep in the back of your mind as to kind of how lame an animal is and really what measures need to be taken. Obviously, if we see an animal that's not wanting to walk properly, we definitely want to investigate it. But it depends on kind of what the issue is kind of what we're seeing. So obviously, the lameness score is 0. They're walking perfectly fine. They're putting all their feet down like they should. There's really no issue that we're seeing. Lameness score of 1 or 2, fairly flat back. May arch a little bit, so they're kind of a little ouchy when they walk. So you can kind of tell walking along, it's a little ouchy. So, or they may have one leg that they're raising a little bit because it's painful for them to step on. A lameness score of 3 is that's what we really consider something that's lame. So an arched back while standing and walking Now, granted, an arched back in general, if they're standing, could also mean they just aren't feeling well. So if you see an animal just kind of hunched over and just kind of standing there, it's definitely something we want to check out. Obviously, if we have one or more limbs being favored, but still partially bearing weight, this is where the score of 3 comes in. Now, when we get to a score of 4, this is severely lame. This means they aren't putting any weight on that hoof at all, or they may not even be able to get up from a lying position. So we want to make sure we're kind of just watching that. So this is just a good kind of basic score system. If you're keeping track of records, things like that, this is kind of what you could keep track of. That's just kind of the basics. So now we'll get into the actual act of trimming those hooves. So I could record a video and show you, but I know on Zoom quite often it gets pretty choppy. So what I've done is gone through and kind of taken a step-by-step picture of kind of the process that I take while trimming hooves. So when you're trimming hooves, you really don't need a lot of equipment. I know there's the hoof bosses out there. There's the hoof knives. There's large nippers. There's all sorts of different types of hoof shears, hoof trimmers that you can use. For me, this is at minimum what I like to have on hand. So I like to have my cut-proof gloves, especially if I'm doing a lot of animals at one time, or we're doing the bucks, something like that, that's a little more hard to handle. So that way my offhand, the one I'm not trimming with, is a little protected. So as I'm holding that hoof, I have less of a chance of cutting this hand. For me, I use the Burgeon and Ball foot rot shears. Just for me, it fits my hand nicely. It's with the number of animals that we do in a year. I might get 2 sets of these in a year, and that's without resharpening them. So this is the kind that I just personally prefer. I know there are some that have a red handle or an orange handle. It's just kind of what feels good in your hand and what you find works well for you. And then I make sure to have at least a little bit of gauze and vet wrap and some blood stop powder on hand, just for a minimum thing. So again, you can go more in depth if you want to with your tools. So these are just some extras. So things like a rasp. So this would be actually just, they called it a horse hoof rasp, but it's just kind of a handled rasp that can help kind of even out just the base of that hoof when you're done. A hoof knife. So you can see 2 examples here with that. So this is something that my husband's really come to use here in the last year to 18 months, just to kind of help kind of smooth out kind of some of that soft frog area when he's trimming. Copper sulfate. So if you see, we'll talk about that use here in a little bit. But really it's good for some foot rot and foot scald issues. So copper sulfate is really easy to find. It's typically used in ponds to treat for algae and things. So most of your home and garden farm stores should have it on hand, especially during the spring, summer, and fall months. Hoof boss is another tool you can have. It's the handheld hoof trimmers, the either corded or non-corded versions. For us, we purchased this because with having currently 10 bucks on the property, their feet tend to get a little harder. So we found that the Hoof Boss just helps save us a little bit of time. This particular one, you can kind of see it looks like a chainsaw blade on top as the grinder wheel. And that's basically what it is. It just helps saw through that hard cartilage that's our hoof. And this is definitely one where you definitely want the cut-proof gloves on it. And then lastly, a large set of nippers that you might use on like horses or equine. Again, to help with some of those thicker hooves. And we'll see where this can come into play here in just a little bit. And then also, I forgot to mention another tool, just some sort of restraint. So either if you have a stand that you can put the animal on, or somebody big enough to be able to hold the animal as you're lifting that foot up, or a chain somewhere. Just some way to kind of keep that animal from moving away from you quite as much as if you were to go out in that pen just grab it and try to trim those hooves without any help. So just our basic hoof anatomy for this morning. So as we're looking at the hoof of our small ruminants, the outside edge on either side is called the hoof wall. So that's the outside edge and kind of around to the inside. Our very points on the end are called the toe. The inner portion of the walls is called the sole or the frog, like we might have on horses. And then we have the heel and the ball of the foot. So that's our basic anatomy of the hoof. Looking at it from the side, we have the dew claw right here with the ball. We've got the frontal edge, and then we have a small coronary band right here at the top of our hoof. So we'll see as we're trimming kind of where each of these are located. So this is just a basic trim example. So these hooves are a little bit long here on the left. So the first thing you're going to do is kind of take the end of your shears, dig out any dirt, manure, packed in material that's going to be in that hoof. And then I usually start by trimming the walls, the outside walls, especially of that hoof, so I can kind of see what's going on with the rest of it. Because usually you've got a little flap of that hoof that's grown over, so it makes it hard to see. So usually I like to get that out of the way first to really see what's underneath. And then I might go to the toe and then inside, and we'll see that example. And then end up trimming off the heel as well to help with that good foot placement. So this is really what we should see when we're done, is just a good level top line. So the base of your foot should match up with the levelness of that coronary band. So it should be pretty much straight across is what we're going to want to see. And we'll see if I did that on my example goat here. So, excuse me. So this is an 18-month-old La Mancha doe. Last time she was trimmed was back in, when did I do all those? End of May, early June is when they were all done. So this is going on, what are we in, October? So we're going on pretty much 5 months of growth on this doe. She'd just gotten done getting bred, and I noticed that her toes were a little bit long. So I put her up on the stand to get her taken care of. So we can see the front feet on the left, kind of a little bit long, getting a little bit, you can see, we'll see an example here, not really straight across, matching top to bottom. And on the back side here, you can kind of see her pasterns, plus she was fighting me a little bit, are starting to get a little bit laid down. So we want to try to kind of correct that if we could. So this is the front foot. This is what it looked like when we got started. So you can see how we have a bit of that hoof has grown over. We've got a pretty long toe on it. The heel is starting to grow. So those are the things that we're going to try to correct. So like I said, my first snip was taking one of those outer walls off. So you can see how that's really opened up and allowed me to see what the rest of the hoof looks like. You can see that white line there is that wall. And then kind of the lighter shade kind of towards the middle is that frog area. She wasn't being cooperative, but we can see I kind of trimmed a little bit of that heel off, kind of helped trim up the toe a little bit there. And then trimmed the inside wall after that so I could get a nice kind of clean cut. And then I've come over here, done the outside wall on this hoof. And you can see on this toe here, there's kind of a black pocket. A lot of times you might see that on a toe that's going to get a little bit long. So the easiest thing to do with that is just cut it right off. For me, I found, especially working with young animals, I want to try to get as much of a rounded or even a flat toe as possible, because as you're cutting, if you leave a point on that end, I've got a couple of scars on my leg to prove that those sharp points on the end of the hooves can do some damage to your legs or your arms. So you want to try to create as much of kind of a flat, kind of rounded, smooth surface as you can. That's where having something like that rasp would come in handy to help kind of cut off any of those really sharp edges that may cut not just yourself, but other animals that they may be in with. But we can see kind of here on the right-hand side, this again was not a pretty show cut, but it was one that is functional for maintenance wise. So you can see where I've trimmed out the outer walls, the toes have been kind of trimmed down a little bit, and then the inner walls, those heels, and then just kind of this hoof area has been trimmed down to help level it out as well. So this was our before on the front hoofs, and this is our after. So you can see she's standing with a much more level appearance. We've trimmed off quite a bit of toe. And so it just kind of helps her stand much more correctly. On the back feet, these can kind of be a little more difficult. So for me on a back foot trim, this is kind of how, if I have a stand, how I kind of stand. So I'll put so I'm trimming the right side of her. So I'll put my left leg up on the stand and kind of hoist that leg up over kind of my thigh region. This kind of hooks this part of the animal over that thigh and makes it a little harder for her to really move about a whole lot. So that gives me a little bit more not having to fight her with my offhand quite as much. But you can see really on this toe, you look at just how long that toe has gotten on this doe. So this is what we're starting with on the back hooves. I didn't do a good job of cleaning out this hoof before I started trimming it. So make sure you clean that out before you really start trimming and you can really see well. You can see again where I've trimmed off the hoof wall. We've got the toe. You can see how it kind of curves a little bit more on this back hoof, but we've trimmed that up so I can kind of see what's going on. You can see kind of this granulated portion down here. I'll go ahead and trim that off eventually. You can see how we've trimmed that off, kind of trimmed the hoof or heel, done a little portion of the inner wall, and my frog. So you can see there, you can see right here at the end, there's a little bit of a red spot. That was just kind of, I think it was a little bit of a bruise that I worked on trimming out. So not really, I haven't really gotten down into the actual flesh blood portion of the hoof. As you're trimming along, you kind of have this really white kind of opaque color. Then you'll start to get like a really baby pink shade. So when you see that baby pink, stop trimming because that's kind of that little layer between there and blood. So you want to make sure that you get trimmed down, but not to where you're having blood everywhere. So you can see this is just an example of one toe to the other toe, how much difference just that one trim made on getting some of that length off. So this is after I've done the second toe on that same hoof. Get it pretty level again. So again, we have our before shot and we have our after. Again, because those toes had been so long, I'd kind of neglected them for probably a couple months too long. Her passengers are still wanting to roll just a little bit, but you can see just the basic shape of it is really what we want. So like I said, kind of training your eye to watch, kind of making sure our coronary band matches the bottom of the foot. So I've kind of drawn a couple of lines here. So you can see on the left-hand side, kind of where we've started. So the top is where our coronary band would be. That's really what we want to be perpendicular to the bottom, sorry, parallel, there we go, parallel with the bottom of our hoof when we're done trimming. So you can see kind of we have an angle at the top, but our angles at the bottom are not parallel to them. So that's really what you want to try to correct. Versus our second hoof here, after we were done trimming, you can see they're much more parallel and similar. Granted, this near hoof probably needs a little bit more work done on her, but I'll work on that again here in probably another month or so to make sure we get it corrected so she's walking around properly. But you can see those angles are much more similarly matched than when we started. So that's really just kind of training your eye to find that coronary band, kind of find that line, and then trim yourself so you end up being flat and kind of even in parallel with it. So what if you trim too close and the hoof bleeds? It happens. It happens a lot. I'll have everywhere from just a little minor bleed to where we'll end up having to get the disbudding iron out and cauterize that wound. Not often, but I think I've had maybe twice this year, I've had to cauterize a hoof. One was because she jerked at just the wrong time and I trimmed a little bit more off than I should have, but she's walking around just fine now. So tools to have on hand to help with hoof bleeds: blood stop powder, gauze, wrap, the disbudding iron, and one of the other tools that we most often have in our barn, cobwebs. Cobwebs are great for helping to staunch kind of any little minor blood flows and things like that. Yes, this is my barn. Yes, that's probably a lot of excessive cobwebs. It needs to be cleaned up. But cobwebs are a great tool just for a quick kind of, just get a wad of them and kind of pack it on that and let the goat stand, or the animal stand on it for a few minutes before you turn them out. They help quite a bit. Granted, usually when I need the cobwebs, it's usually after we've cleaned and I can't find a single cobweb in our barn, but cobwebs are a great tool. So those are our basics on trimming an actual hoof. It's the very same whether you're doing goats or small ruminants. You want to make sure you match that coronary band parallel with the bottom of that hoof to really give them that good base. So some of the concerns that we have and issues that we see when we're looking at hooves, there are a few, but they're similar for both sheep and goats. So primarily they're hoof diseases. So our most common ones that we see are going to be foot scald, foot rot, and foot abscesses. And we'll go a little more in depth into these here in a minute. Little less common, things like laminitis, which would be founder, blue tongue, sore mouth, and foot and mouth disease. So not nearly as common. So our three most common, the foot scald, foot rot, and foot abscesses, are really from a bacterial infection versus these lower ones, the laminitis, blue tongue, sore mouth, foot and mouth disease. Those are really a viral infection. So there's a little bit of a difference in how we're going to treat these. So getting into foot scald. So foot scald is caused by the bacteria Fusobacterium necrophorum. Don't ask me to say that again. I've practiced it several times. So usually it's found in all small ruminant feces and is always present on grazed pastures, dry lots, pens. It's found everywhere. Really, it increases activity when wet conditions, where there's mud, manure, things like that that have started to accumulate. So really we see kind of foot scald and foot rot conditions in maybe the spring or the fall, where maybe the lots haven't been cleaned out yet, or the animals are kind of milling about a little bit more kind of together. So that's really when we see those issues. And foot scald is really just kind of an irritation between the toes, kind of that soft tissue area there. Yeah, we'll get my Vulcan sign out. So between the tissue there. So really it infects that soft area like we can see here in this demonstration hoof. So here's an example of that foot scald. So first signs are going to be a little bit of limping or kind of holding that foot off the ground a little bit because it's going to be tender. It's a little bit of an infection. So they're going to want to try to stay off it. Oftentimes when we see animals grazing on their knees, we'll know there might be a hoof issue going on. Again, another thing you're going to want to check out and look at. So basically it's an inflammation of the skin between the toes. It'll be kind of pink to white in color, kind of a moist, raw, sensitive to the touch. This won't have a smell to it. The foot rot that we'll talk about next definitely does. So this needs to be treated because usually foot scald is what then leads to foot rot. So there are a lot of ways to treat it, and I'll get to that in just a minute. So because we often see foot scald then lead to foot rot, this is what foot rot is and what the difference is. So foot rot is a combination of the Fusobacteria necrophorum and then this Dichelobacter nodosus. So these bacteria require irritation between the toes in order to gain that entry for infection. So once we get that irritation from the necrophorum, kind of that starting, that's when the denodotus really kind of comes in and then increases that infection to the actual foot rot. So, or something like hard frozen ground can kind of cause that irritation, just kind of a little bit of redness to kind of start occurring. And so when that ground warms up, like we said in the spring, that kind of little bit of irritation area is, again, a great breeding ground to start the foot scald and then the foot rot. So really we see this kind of happen in the spring or when we have really wet summers as well. So the foot rot itself, obviously we have the foot scald that kind of comes into play here in the interdigital space where kind of that pink area is. Foot rot itself then works its way into the frog and the hoof wall as well. So this is a beautiful example of this picture by one of the specialists at Purdue of foot rot. Looking at this picture, I can smell this picture looking at it. It has a very distinct scent to it. So it's the erosion of the tissue between the sole of the toe, so that frog or sole area, and the hard outer hoof wall. You can really see where it just looks like it's, yeah, I know, sorry. So it just looks like it's kind of just literally rotted away. So when trimming the hoof, the outer shell of the wall will be separated from this inner portion. You can kind of see on this right-hand side here, you can really kind of see where it started to kind of just pull away. So severe cases of foot rot may be accompanied by the presence of the pus and foul smell. If you've never smelled it, it's got its own distinct flavor to it. We had here, it's probably been about 3 years ago, we had a really wet spring and we had several cases of foot rot. We probably treated, probably 10 animals at that point in time for foot rot. Luckily, we were able to get it cured, and I don't think any of them came back with that reinfection later. But it's just a matter of when they start to kind of limp a little bit, you really want to get on top of it and get it trimmed back. So you can see they've done some trimming on this toe here. This hoof would require quite a bit of trimming. Usually I take that all the way down until I start to see fresh tissue or blood. And then from there, so animals with severe foot rot may show fever, loss of appetite, hoof deformity. If you see the hoof start to kind of look weird, it's time to get in there and see what's going on. So for the treatment of foot scald and foot rot, really the first thing you want to do is isolate those animals and trim their hooves, because again, it's a bacterial infection, so it could pass to other animals. You want to inspect, make sure there aren't other causes of lameness, but if you pick that hoof up and you see that, you're going to have a pretty good idea of what's going on. So treat. So really kind of an easy solution and treatment for this is using copper sulfate or zinc sulfate. So like I said, that blue powder that you can get at most farm and garden stores, zinc sulfate. So there's a product out there called, I think it's Dr. Mayer's foot rot, foot scald. It's a liquid product that you can apply. So basically you want to put that on there and keep them in a clean, dry environment for about 24 hours. So for us, we prefer kind of the copper sulfate. So we'll get our gauze pad. We'll put a little bit of kind of a lotion on there so the sulfate kind of sticks to that pad. Put a pretty good amount, probably 2-3 tablespoons of copper sulfate on that pad. Hold that hoof up. Usually it's a 2-person job, and then get that packed around that hoof and really in where that infection is. And then we'll wrap that hoof in the vet wrap and leave that on there for 2 or 3 days, usually at least. So hoofs heal rapidly. So after 1 or 2 days of twice-a-day treatment. So for us using that copper sulfate, because it is that powder when we pack it in there, we actually go a couple of days before we'll check it again. But if you're using something like the zinc sulfate, that would be a liquid, that's where you'll get to do it a couple times. Yes, so this will be recorded and I'll post the YouTube link here at the end. So it's, if you search, put her name in here real quick. So if you search for Sarah Zemansky on YouTube, she's one of our other Purdue small ruminant team members. She has all the recordings on there and usually tries to get them uploaded. Milk and meat withholding time, I will have to look at those, Linda. So I'll have my email at the end. So if you want to email me that question, or I can look it up at the end, we can see if there's withholding. I think because it's more of an external, we've never done that. But it's not like we're putting in penicillin or other things straight into the body. So we've never done that, but I honestly haven't looked. So I will look at the end. Remind me, Linda. So again, yep. So maintaining clean, well-bedded pens will reduce the risk of foot scald and foot rot, just because you're not maintaining that moist environment that the bacteria likes. So why are the zinc and copper sulfates good for hoofs? Just that zinc and copper sulfate, that sulfate capability in there is really what helps draw out that infection and kind of reduce that moistness that's in that hoof from all the wetness. And so that's why it really just helps to dry out that hoof. So that's why the bacteria then don't prefer it, and that's why they end up dying off. All right, so kind of our next bacterial thing, and again, one of the more common things we see is abscesses. So you could call it bumblefoot, heel abscess, toe abscess. It's an abscess. So we do ever use the rasp for the frog or heel, or just the outer? Just basically the whole hoof when we're trimming. So I've got my hoof done, and we'll just take the rasp and kind of rub across it a couple of times in kind of all directions, just to kind of give it kind of that nice, clean, flat surface. Just kind of helps finish it off. So you don't have any little hanging, go back to voting, any little hanging chads hanging off of it. So on an abscess, basically this is an infected lump of tissue caused by a bacteria from an injury. Typically is where we see abscesses. So either a puncture wound from a sharp object, a sharp rock, something like that. So usually we only see abscesses in one hoof. Something like foot rot, you can see in that picture, we had the one toe was pretty well rotted, and it was starting into the heel of the second toe. An abscess will usually just be one toe or the other. So usually with an abscess as well, we'll see kind of that lameness score of kind of a 2 to a 3 or more, depending on how deep that abscess is. So this is where we really won't see much weight being put on that hoof. We'll also see kind of that abscess kind of work its way out up to kind of that kind of hair region right up above the top of the hoof as well. So if you start to kind of see a little bit of kind of a pink area up there, it may be an abscess trying to work its way out. So it'll be hot, swollen, red. There'll be kind of a lump area. So maybe again, because it is an abscess, it is an infection, there's probably going to be some ooze involved. So again, not a pretty picture coming up, but gives you a pretty good idea. So on abscesses, treatment involves draining or lancing the abscess of what we call necrotic or rotting tissue, and the pus as well. So you can see on this upper portion here where that abscess has really started to come out the top of the hoof. It's just kind of a nasty kind of pus pocket. And here on the bottom is another example. This is what we call a strawberry abscess because it kind of looks like a strawberry. So those are what the abscesses look like. Granted, this hoof hasn't been trimmed really well recently, but it's not, the sole is not pulling away from the wall itself. It's just that pus pocket that had developed. So if you're not really experienced with lancing abscesses, we really kind of recommend that you contact a vet to help kind of get that, just so there's not excess infection that then gets reintroduced back into the hoof. And typically on an abscess, again, you'll have antibiotics you can put on it, and then usually wraps, potentially some penicillin, if you can find it right now. So getting into some of our less common issues, first would be blue tongue. Looking at this picture, can't decide. It's either really improperly trimmed hoof, or it might honestly be a pig hoof, but it gives you a really good idea of these lines that we'll talk about. So blue tongue is really a non-contagious viral disease that's spread by biting insects. Really, we hear about blue tongue more commonly in deer. So those of us that are near, that hunt quite a bit, or might be involved with the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, we hear about blue tongue occurring in deer. It doesn't show up as a hoof issue that often, but it is a potential. So basically they cause foot lesions, and that coronet band, so this is a great example of a coronet band, will turn kind of a red to brown color. So you can kind of see right there, we have kind of a reddish brown shade going with that coronet band. So really, if we see lameness, but we don't see any foot rot, foot scald, abscesses going on, but we see this lighter coronet band with that kind of red and brown, you're going to want to be calling your vet really quick, because there's a good possibility you have blue tongue. So with that, again, being a viral disease, it's going to you're going to need some pretty heavy antibiotics. If not, that animal may have to be culled, just because it's a disease that you don't want to have spread just because of those biting insects, those mosquitoes and things like that. So definitely work with your veterinarian if you see these signs. Foot and mouth disease, honestly, not really something we need to worry about here in America, but it's something to bring up. So it's a highly contagious disease, especially in cattle and pigs, especially. Again, not one really see here, but there'll be blisters and ulcerations in the mouth, snout, tongue, and at the top of the feet. So again, a hoof issue, and this is an example of what that would look like. Luckily, like I said, it's been eradicated. U.S. has eradicated 9 outbreaks. The last was in 1929. So luckily, knock on wood, we haven't really had any outbreaks here in the U.S. in the last almost 100 years. Canada has had some issues here back. Oh, I was still in high school. I remember that. So back in the early 2000s, and then the European community is still working on eradicating it. So this is one that we don't really see here in the US, but just one to kind of be aware of as we're educating today. One that I see honestly quite more often, especially now as we get a lot of kind of hobby farmers and things like that, is this laminitis, or this founder of the goats. This is probably the first thing that I'm going to think about if I see a goat out grazing or eating on its knees, especially if it's kind of quite often that this animal's on its knees. Not every once in a while trying to get that one blade of grass that just looks a lot better out of reach. This is a common routine. So laminitis is really caused by an inadequate blood flow in that hoof, and that is caused by digestive issues. So basically we're resulting in an excessive intake of grain. So for example, if you have, we've got a neighbor of ours that has a goat out with their cattle, and they have a steer stuffer. So that animal has unlimited amounts of grain, and we'll see what that looked like here in just a moment. Also, if we change the grain too quickly, so if we change their diet really quickly, that can cause acidosis in the stomach, which is that change of the acid content, and causes a lot of issues. So if we see this, we're not just seeing laminitis, but we're seeing a ruminant issue as well. So if an animal does recover from this, usually they exhibit unusual foot growth or permanent lameness. Again, they're going to constantly want to walk on their knees. It's just kind of rough on them. So that's where we can see up here, this animal is kind of walking on their knees. And down here, you can see the right side of that hoof is really kind of bowed out and just looks almost like a club foot is what it looks like that we have going on. So this is my tale of trimming a foundered goat. My husband and I have done a few of these for friends and neighbors, but this is what this poor guy looks like. Again, this is a boar wether. He's probably 5 or 6 years old now, so a little bit larger. So going over to this place, we didn't really have a stand or anything like that to use. So it ended up taking, I think, 3 of us or 2 of us really to kind of lay him on his side and kind of, I had the back feet held and then somebody else had kind of up by the shoulder held down so he wouldn't move around a whole lot. But this is the hoof that we're starting with. This was the front right hoof. And so you can really see that one toe is so excessively long. So this is one of those cases where having those more heavy duty, more equine hoof nippers really comes into play. So you can see just, they have a little more yeah, whatever the word, you have a little bit more pressure that you can apply to that hoof to trim this material off. So you can see we just kind of started trimming away a little bit, kind of chunking it off as we could. So he kind of started back here by the heel where it should be a little more natural line and just started biting into it with those nippers. You can see eventually that chunk came off. And you can see it here on the ground. That was the toe that was taken, basically trimmed down to where it was a more natural hoof. See, he's still working at it with those trimmers. So we trim the other side to the proper length. So that's where we see it on the left. And you can see that right side kind of looks like a little bit more of like a club foot. So that's kind of what we were able to get it trimmed down to. So this is where we started. Again, that huge toe. The left side needed a little trimming, but wasn't too bad considering. And you can see where we were able to get it down, where you could actually put it down a little more properly. But you can see here on his knee, look at how much of a pad that's built up because he was walking around on his knees so much. The other toes, not really that bad. I mean, they needed trim, just a normal trim, but because of that big chunk, that's where you could tell that he had actually foundered. He's doing fine. He keeps living, but we just have to keep on top of that hoof to make sure that he's able to walk around a little bit easier. So that's kind of my founder story. Next kind of disease we're looking at is sore mouth or contagious ecthyma. So this is a lameness, again, caused by blisters appearing on the skin near the top of that hoof wall. So you can kind of see in between our toes here, really some red, nasty blisters going on. So blisters appear on both the mouth and other areas of sheep and goat bodies. May see it on the udders as well. So if you start to see some blisters appearing on the mouth, you definitely want to watch it, and be careful. This is something that could be zoonotic, so you want to make sure that you wear gloves when handling an animal's sore mouth because it could be passed on to you as well. So the lesions can be treated with an antibiotic or an ointment with a broad spectrum antibiotic on it. Again, working with your veterinarian to obtain that antibiotic. So it says it can be prevented with a vaccination. We've never vaccinated for our animals. Sore mouth is also referred to as ORF, O-R-F. So it's kind of like chicken pox. Once it runs through them, they kind of have a natural immunity to it. For us, we had never had ORF in our herd until probably about 4 years ago. We had brought in an animal and quarantined her, but it was just one of those infections that she carried around with her, and it spread throughout our herd. So over the course of the next about 8 months, we had a little bit of it occur in our milking does, but the next spring in our kids, we had probably 60 to 70% of our kids came down with ORF to some degree or another. Nobody actually died from it, just because of the lesions, but we had a couple that had some pretty decent lesions going on, but they were still able to eat. So it's just something to kind of watch and look for. And then just overall, when we're talking about just general overgrowth of those hooves, I know we've probably all seen pictures of animals being picked up from auctions that just have really curled under pasterns, toes that are 5-6 inches long. That's kind of a really excessive overgrowth. But just kind of general overgrowth, kind of like we saw on the doe that I started with. Really, no, kind of that excessive overgrowth, really not practical to try to bring it all back in one trimming. If you can get just kind of the basics done, so just kind of reduce that hoof height, kind of reduce that toe length a little bit. It may take a couple of trimmings, 2 or 3 trimmings to get them back to really what that hoof should look like. So it's better to kind of do a little bit at a time. So do 2 to 3 trimmings, maybe over the course of a month, versus trying to get it all off at one time. Just because with as long as that hoof has gotten, there's going to be some different nerves in there, a couple of blood vessels and such as well that could have grown with that hoof. So you want to kind of trim back a little bit to kind of help really reduce infection, reduce that chance of getting into some of those blood vessels and things. So just kind of take a little bit at a time. So again, remembering kind of that rule of thumb. So kind of keeping that hairline or that coronary band parallel with the base of that hoof. Again, it's going to take some practice. Like I said, it was probably about year 3 into our marriage before I really started trimming hooves myself. So I've been at it for 7 years, and there's still some times where I'm not quite sure something looks right. So I've got to go ask the husband. So again, it just takes patience. It just takes practice. This was one of our La Mancha bucks here. This is Bubba. He's probably close to 300 pounds. So trying to get him put on a stand doesn't work so well because his neck, he wore close to I think he was wearing a 34-inch collar when we take him to shows and things. So big boy. So for us to trim him, we've got these chains that we hook our dairy does to. So luckily he stands pretty well. So we just bring him in, chain him up. And this is my husband kind of working on his hooves. You can see on his knees there where the kind of the pad and the sole's kind of worn away a little bit. He had a habit of wanting to eat on his knees. It wasn't because he had found it or anything. It was just kind of how he ate, just trying to reach those batches. But it's something that we definitely kept track of and kept looking for just to make sure that he stayed sound. Any of our breeding animals stay sound just so we can get a good soundness for everybody. So, all right. So topic is hoof care and trimming. You covered some lameness factors. Do you see straw mites causing lameness? So really kind of those straw mites, kind of not necessarily the lameness, but they can certainly cause that irritation between those toes, kind of interdigital area, and kind of that lower area. So mites are kind of more of kind of that skin irritation. So because of that skin irritation there, you're seeing kind of there along the hooves, along that hairline. Yeah, they're going to be sore. They're going to be touchy, but just because it hurts. So that would be something where you'd want to go ahead and treat for the mites rather than more of an actual hoof issue. So for the mite treatment, trying to remember. So mites would be more controlled by, yeah, lost it. It's a liquid. Let me look real quick. So it'd be, yep, topical, yep, there we go. Yep, so yeah, so the mites are more of, they may occur to be lame, but it's just because they're sore from the biting of those insects. But yep, that's certainly something to consider. So, yep, great. Thank you, Erica. Going back up to Linda's question. Let me look here real quick, Linda. All right. Looking at this here real quick. See what this says. It's gonna be a pretty long article. We're not gonna read that real quick. I'll get back to you, Linda, on the copper sulfate thing. So, all right. So again, if you're interested in this recording, it may take a couple of weeks, but it should be found on this YouTube channel here. And so that's where all of our previous small ruminant recordings can be found. And so I actually have one last little poll for you all to complete, if you wouldn't mind, just kind of see if you've increased your knowledge at all. But again, I thank you all for being with us today. You have my contact information here. So if you have any questions afterwards or any thoughts, feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to answer those questions for you. So with that, if there are no further questions, I hope you all have a fantastic day. And go ahead, Linda, and send me an email or give me a call after we get done, and I'll try to find that withdrawal information if there's any on copper sulfate for meat or milk. So, all right, well, thank you all, and sorry I ruined a couple of your lunches with a couple of those pictures, but I hope you have a fantastic day. So.